Presenter, our first speaker is, Josh Richards, and he's actually going to be presenting a paper called Laughing at Mars, Using Comedians and Storytellers for Widespread Public Engagement in Space. Now, Josh is probably one of the most unusual people you will meet. He's a physicist, explosives engineer, soldier, comedian, astronaut candidate. Yes, he can never be accused of being boring. He says in the last decade he's picked up booby traps for the Australian Army, slogged through the mud with British commandos, been a science advisor to the richest artist in the world, and performed stand-up wearing a giant koala suit just to confuse the audience. So Josh found his true calling in September 2012 when he discovered the Mars One project and is currently one of the 100 astronaut candidates shortlisted for a one-way mission to Mars. So we're not too sure what that actually says about his state of mind. But Josh is a highly visible ambassador for science, technology, engineering and arts, the STEAM program, and he loves engendering engagement for students and adults alike. And this is a man who once lived, what was it, for a week in a glass cube at on the edge of Sydney Harbour to publicise.
We'll talk about it, don't worry. Thank you very much for that intro, Kerry. As Kerry mentioned, as part of that, my name is Josh Richards. I am currently one of 100 people shortlisted for the first human mission to Mars in 2031. That is how I've been introducing myself to people for the last 5 years. As Kerry touched on in the bio, I have done a few other things before then, so we'll skip through. My background originally is as an applied physicist, which somehow eventually draws you into dressing up as a giant koala and screaming at people for 45 minutes at a time. I spent all up about 6 years with the military. I basically specialised in explosives engineering. I worked in the mining industry as well. I originally started with the Australian Army, switched into the Navy, and then eventually somehow wound up running around with British commandos. It was weird. Don't do that. Don't recommend it to your kids either. But for some bizarre reason, after 6 years in the military, I decided I wanted to become a full-time stand-up comic. And that generally involved dressing up in a giant koala and just letting out a whole lot of rage. I kind of got that out of my system. I'd done 4 years up at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. I was almost burnt out with stand-up comedy. It's not a particularly forgiving industry to work in. There's a lot of egos and a lot of folks who like to very competitive. And so I was almost done with stand-up comedy. I'd written a comedy show about basically about doomsday, called Apocalypse Meow. It was cheerful, it was fun, it involved a terrifying baboon puppet. Keith looks back in anger. Keith, the anger management koala, would help people work through their anger management issues while showing a startling lack of it. I was doing okay at the stand-up comedy thing, but I wasn't enjoying it. And so I decided I wanted to write one more comedy show about sending people one way to Mars. I knew as part of my physics degree that we probably had the technology to get to Mars, but the real barrier was actually bringing people back. And so I decided to start writing a comedy show about this idea when I found an organisation that was planning to do exactly that. It was literally after the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in September of 2012. I sat down in a little coffee shop, typed in Mars One Way and found these guys. For folks who aren't familiar with Mars One, they're essentially an international not-for-profit organisation based in the Netherlands. They have had a lot of press, both good and bad, over the last 5 years. And we essentially started with 200,000 people who started the application process, and over the last 5 years we've narrowed that down to the 100 that still remain. I've used Mars One as an opportunity to engage adults. I recognised very early on there's a lot of people doing a lot of things for engaging kids in school with STEM, but there wasn't necessarily the same outreach going on for engaging adults with science. And so me being an offensive, swearing koala actually had applications for engaging with adults. So fairly early on, I decided to steal a line from the Hoodoo Gurus album, Mars Needs Guitars, and essentially wrote a comedy show based around the concept that the ideal 4-person crew to first go to Mars would probably have personality profiles very similar to the way a rock band operates. And it provided a perfect metaphor to turn around and go, yeah, you've got the obnoxious lead singer, but he's offset by the drummer who just keeps hitting drums all the time. You've got a weirdo keyboard player that feeds into things as well, and then the bass player who's just really cool. Like, the idea of these personalities balancing off each other actually married up quite well with the kind of personalities that you might necessarily see on the first crew to Mars. The idea, again, was about using comedy as a hook for adults. And the basis behind it was that if you could hook the adults engaged with science, they would then feed down to what their kids were doing. They would actually have some understanding if kids were really excited about, their kids were excited about space, they would actually have a platform they'd be able to talk to their kids about as well. So the goal was jargon-free. It was very much based on my own personal experiences, focused on friends from my history who kind of filled those roles in that rock band. It only ended up having 5 shows. It was all tied very much to National Science Week. We ran 3 shows for National Science Week in 2013. I toured the show as well, and we took it to the Netherlands. About 350 people saw it across 5 shows. Building off that, wanting to try and expand and sort of look at maybe the implications of going to Mars for all of humanity, I started working on Becoming Martian. So this was depersonalised. Rather than being my stories, it was a focus on how it would impact everybody. So very much looking at the physiological effects of how our bodies would change by going to Mars, the kind of psychology required for the folks that would go, and basically the cultural impacts. And I was very disappointed with this show in the end. I withdrew pretty much all of my personality out of it. It was about transferring information. I very much focused on science communication rather than being entertaining. And while people enjoyed the show, it felt dry. It felt dead inside. I was actually quite happy to put it to bed and let go of the whole thing. We, again, toured, only did 4 shows, toured around the world as well. About 300 people. There was a real focus on making this depersonalised, and it sucked all the fun out of it. I actually hated doing the show. So, at the same time, it was originally developed as a book, and the book wasn't ready for National Science Week 2014, but the book came back in later on. So, learning from the mistakes made with Mars Needs Guitars, and then learning from the mistakes with the stage show for Becoming Martian. I also ran a whole series of other events alongside Becoming Martian. So is everyone here familiar with Kerbal Space Program? A few of you? If you haven't, go and look it up. It's awesome. It's basically like these tiny green minion things running around, running their own space program. Relatively accurate orbital mechanics, sort of accurate rocketry as well. Really amazing engagement program for kids, but also something that adults can wrap their head around at the same time. So we basically played Kerbal Space Program on an 11-metre wide LED screen with about 400 people hovering around. So heaps of fun. We had a poet who had recently written a bit of poetry that was getting quite a bit of traction about Mars One. She was visiting Perth at the time that I was there for National Science Week, so we did a collaborative event together where she shared her poetry and I talked about the physics behind what we were actually trying to do. Organised a science-themed comedy show as well, where essentially every comedian that was getting up on stage needed to talk about some sort of favourite science topic. Didn't have to be accurate, didn't have to be even particularly knowledgeable, just something that they could geek out about with science and people would engage with it. We sold out that event. That event usually has about 100 people turn up. We sold it out with the 120 people that we could fit in the room about a week before it actually even started. So people were desperate for this. Adults wanted to engage with it and do something sciencey for National Science Week. I also presented at the National Young Writers Festival because originally Becoming Martian was developed as a book. It wasn't ready in 2014, but there was an opportunity for me to run events at the Writers Festival and engage another audience through that. I wanted to learn from all the mistakes I've made with Mars Needs Guitars and Becoming Martian. Becoming Martian felt dead because it was depersonalised. This was the opposite. This was uncomfortable for everyone that was involved. There was a mild nudity clause that was involved with it as well. That's how vulnerable I was getting on stage. Serious overshare, and people loved it. It was an opportunity to be raw, to be truly vulnerable. People were always asking, how has your life changed by signing up for a one-way mission to Mars? And I had that opportunity to share it with people in every sense. And while I loved it, I was also really glad to let it go as well. And you see the numbers on it. We ended up ran a 8-month tour, 8 months travelling around during 2016. We travelled to all sorts of different countries, performed in Israel, Ireland, the US, all sorts of different areas. 24 shows in total, 2,250 people ended up seeing it, and yeah, over 2,000 people saw the right cheek of my ass. It was an experience for all of us. Anyway, I was really glad to let this show go. It had been quite an experience to share it and really get all those ideas out on stage for the whole group of people, but I still had a huge amount of material that I'd hung on to from the book originally. So, naturally, there was an opportunity here in 2017 to come back to the original idea and turn it all into a book. Again, learning from the mistakes that had been made with the stage show originally, learning from the things that really succeeded with the stage show in 2016 with Cosmic Nomad, and brought in some more personal storytelling into the book that combined it all together. It's still not a perfect product, but it's definitely something that I'm very proud of. And in terms of getting access to different people from different audiences, not everyone could turn up to a stage show. Not everyone could make it to the show when I was touring in a particular country. So now there was an opportunity to turn around to people and say, hey, if you missed the stage show, here's something that's even better with even more detail that you can sit down jargon-free and access it, and still include even more stories that weren't necessarily in the original product. So it's been an experience so far. So this launched again for National Science Week in 2017. So we're just starting to see the sales and the uptake sort of take on from there. So I'll run through very quickly a couple of other events. Thank you, running out of time. As Kerry mentioned, I spent a week in a glass box in Sydney early last year. It was horrifying. Don't do it. Don't volunteer to live in a tiny glass box while people tap on the outside for literally 24 hours a day. That said, 50,000 adults walked past and engaged with that particular activation. It was all tied around the DVD release of The Martian here in Australia. The extraordinary amount of engagement that we had over those 5 days was absolutely amazing. We literally put space science in primetime TV every single day for 5 days. And the numbers bore out of it. We had 95 million people that actually engaged with it through media. So, whole raft of other events. The laboratory is an example of science storytelling, where scientists essentially share their favourite science stories or their favourite biographies for scientists. Moving to Mars was basically a chat with Mars One candidates in Boston late 2016. And I spoke at the Adelaide Festival here back in May to quite an interesting group of people as well. So huge numbers and huge opportunities. So I'll keep skipping forward. Media engagement as well. People want to talk about this. If you have an interesting story to share and some weird hook that you can hook people with, the numbers bear out in the end as well. Ultimately comes down to storytelling and having a human element in all of it. When I took out the human element, people were interested but didn't really care. So it has been a very interesting 4.5 years. The take-home message from all of this, I suppose, is that we often ignore non-specialist adults, people who aren't already in the space industry, folks who might have kids that are interested in space, but they don't think space is for them. They're easily engaged. You just kind of have to be really relatable and interesting when you talk about it. It can't be jargon-filled. It needs to be something that they can relate to and they can understand, hence using a rock band as a way to explain space psychology. I'll leave you a couple of notes, just the kind of take-homes from the last 5 years. There are incredible opportunities for comedians and storytellers to engage. They want to engage with science, but they don't necessarily know how to. There are amazing opportunities for science communicators to basically engage with a huge audience that's often ignored. And the trickle-down effect for that is quite amazing. These numbers don't include any of the school visits that I've done. I've spoken to about 100,000 kids in the last 5 years. And there's been public events, all sorts of other things. This is purely just aimed for adults. So, and like I said, mass media is an amazing amplifier for all of this, but you have to have that human story. So, there's all sorts of things happening in the future, but I'll skip ahead and finish up. I don't know if we got amazing support from Inspiring Australia and also Mars One, who's just completely revolutionised the entire way I'm spending my time on my last 14 years on this planet, hopefully. So, extraordinary support from people over the last 5 years, but I won't waste too much more time listing through them. So, do we have time for questions? Maybe
yes,
not.
We have about 2 minutes, so we have time for maybe 1 or 2 microphone, which
will allow people to hear everyone. So I'm just gonna
Okay, so that was a great talk, and I could ask a serious question, but I'm not going to. Why did you show so many people your right arse cheek? I want to know.
So for those of you who are big Futurama fans, the first Futurama film involves a character called Fry, who actually has a tattoo on his right bum cheek of the robot that's in it, Bender, that allows them to travel back in time. I have been called Fry most of my life, and so when I turned 30, I decided to tick off an entry on my 101 Things to Do Before You Die by getting a tattoo on my right arse cheek of a robot spaceman, because it's awesome.
just wondering, did you seek out did you seek out the press by sending out press releases, or did they find you, and did you use social media as one of those tools?
So social media has been amazing, and it provides an easy avenue for people to find you. They type your name into, it's ultimately about Google responses. So someone puts Josh Richards Mars into Google, they find me. If they just put Josh Richards, they find a NASCAR driver, and it drives me nuts. But Josh Richards Mars, they find me relatively quickly. Twitter's a great way to keep content up. Facebook is the same story. Instagram as well. All those different avenues of continuously sharing what you're up to means that people know you're active. They know that you're still doing things. So often I will find limited things that actually came through Mars One themselves. Journalists would engage me directly through social media, or having a contact form on my website has ultimately been one of the most useful things, particularly for speaking engagements, schools, all those sort of things. 95% of that comes from someone going and looking at the website and going, hey, he does these things, can you come and do it with us? So,
Thank you so much.
thank you very much.
Appreciate it.